the finals, the Champions Chess Tour 2023. Glasses off, business time. Wesley, so he's got to choose his first move. Which pawn?
It's the title match. He does adjust Jadoop the king, and it is 1b3. Shakes his head. He is surprised. Magnus was not expecting this.
I can't tell if he's more surprised or offended. B3 is not an opening you see at the highest levels of chess, at least not in this time control. You usually see it in blitz chess. But Magnus probably didn't take it so seriously, considering Wesley, he seemed to use it just to get something. But Magnus has not even played his very first move.
Wow, not many people in world chess have the courage to play this type of opening against Magnus Carlsen. Usually they're trying to occupy the center, trying to force the issue. And look at Magnus, he's bemused. He's just shocked here, looking up at the ceiling, just trying to pick how to react to this shock, this surprise. And eventually he plays a bit of copycat, mirror image here. He gets ready to fianchetto black start squared bishop, playing g6, the knight out. And will Wesley take this knight? Big stylistic choice. White is flexible. No, he just pushes a pawn, and, okay, we see the first mind games at work.
And Magnus Carlsen himself has employed 1b3 with the white side. Definitely something that, yes, Wesley won a game against Nordebek Abdusattorov in the semifinals, but nobody could have expected this seriously to happen against. We were talking about this being the anti-young player chess approach in the opening. The guy Wesley's facing right now is not exactly a young player.
Well, you could argue, still be in his prime. And I can't believe that I, of all people, am about to say this. Did Magnus prepare by looking at Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it? The answer is likely no. But Wesley asked the question, what should I do? He posed that question to Fabiano Caruana, and Fabi said the key to playing Magnus, jokingly, is to prepare for and against 1b3. So we have that opening on the board. We're going to have fianchetto from both of Black's bishops on the longest diagonals. And Wesley, he was the first to surprise Magnus. Now he's the one in the think tank. There is no combative play, no tension between pieces just yet.
Yeah. We're going to have a lot of fun from the start. We were discussing whether this will be a cagey start, a more solid approach, but it's clear that Wesley wants to start with energy, in a combative manner, in an unexpected opening approach here. David, what's the best strategy when you're taken by surprise early on? Perhaps Magnus was considering that b3 would be an option, but maybe not taking it that seriously. How do you approach that situation on the board?
Yeah, it feels like there's always two different paths you can take when you're surprised. One, you think, okay, I'm being surprised here. I want to kind of rise to the challenge, fight fire with fire. I'm going to punish my opponent for their temerity in playing such an opening. Or you just think, I want to survive. I want to kind of negotiate the opening, navigate that safely, just get a solid position. As long as I've weathered the initial storm, I will be able to fight on level terms a bit later.
And Robert, what do you think? Is this Magnus taking fire by fire, or just saying, you know what, you got the first surprise in, I'm playing to equalize here?
He's played some feeler moves thus far, but I did see him roll up his sleeves, and so he looks locked in and ready to fight for the center. From the black side, you can always push the c-pawn up 2 squares. In fact, by playing b6 early on, not only are you welcoming a fianchetto light square bishop, but you can fight for the center in this manner using your c-pawn to combat a d-pawn. And Magnus, he delays that choice. He castles kingside. Both players are playing normal moves at this stage. I would say now that the opening surprise is past us and past them, it's about who's about to come up with a plan.
Yeah, both sides are super flexible right now. Wesley can push a bunch of different pawns. Most likely the white king is going to copy and castle on the king side within the next few turns. But whether white fianchettos his light squared bishop as well is the first question. Wesley now mulling those questions over. If white does fianchetto, then we'll see all 4 bishops on the longest possible diagonals, all kind of neutralizing each other, and roughly level play there. White's kind of pride and joy right now is the pawn center. White has extra space in the middle, so Wesley will be trying to figure out a way to ensure that is maintained over the next few moves. But he's peering into the future. He's trying to work out a plan of action, the next half dozen moves or so, and this is kind of a good moment to pause, because we are reaching the end of the opening. The surprise is over, as Robert says, and it will soon be about those middle game plans.
Well, we might see copycat chess when it comes to the bishops. The center definitely is, just for now, advantage Wesley with space. But that means for Magnus, it's going to be about getting a break in the center. And once you're finished with the development, you want to strike with either the c-pawn moving forward and that would be my choice of break in these kind of setups, to eventually force Wesley to decide what he wants to do with those pawns.
It's always nice to control the center, but when somebody establishes their pawns on the 4th rank like this, you can challenge them with one simple pawn move. We're talking about the c5 pawn push. If Wesley ever decides to push pawns even further, that's closer to Black's clamp, easier to chisel, easier to chisel at that center. And so for Wesley, he's deciding how to continue his development here. I would be fianchettoing, but I'm wondering if Wesley's looking at this position saying we're on neutral ground, both of us out of whatever semblance of preparation we could have had. It's like, I don't love my position because I don't know what to do next. It's actually coming up with a plan, not just individual moves.
Yeah, and Wesley, for a while, he had his head in hands. I was wondering whether he was napping, catching up with some much-needed sleep there. But it feels like he's just indecisive. Feels like he's frozen somewhat. This is a lot of time to invest at this early stage. We're still only on move 5, as we see with the move counter on the top left hand of your screens, and he's looking away from the board. He's just mulling over. It's a stylistic choice. He knows he's got basically 2 options of setting up his pieces, especially when it comes to developing his light squared bishop, and at some point he just needs to choose. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what he's in the mood for. Ultimately, these minutes that he's spending will be much needed later on in the game.
Are we getting shades of that Caruana-Carlsen game where Fabiano spent way too much time in that game 4 of set 1? Of course, this position is a lot different than that game, but right now, Wesley could play a number of moves quite quickly. I just wouldn't advise getting in time trouble against Magnus Carlsen, especially when you're both in this territory where you're unfamiliar with the starting position here. I think that Wesley shouldn't be worried. He's done nothing wrong, but he's spending a lot of time, and we've seen Wesley be shaky, even by his own words, even what Nordirbeck was saying, in time trouble. So for Magnus, he should be feeling good. He's looking confident sitting across from Wesley right now.
More than a 3-minute thing by Wesley, so at this early stage of the game, and the 2 choices that David was referring to, either moves the king pawn forward or decides to develop the bishop on the G2 square. He goes for the latter, the fianchettoing, and we see the bishops facing each other. What kind of middle games does this opening setup get into? Does this mean that White eventually wants to try to get more space in the center, perhaps pushing the e-pawn not 1 step, but 2 steps forward if allowed?
Yeah, I think he would love that, Wesley, so if allowed. But he is slightly behind in development here because Black has already castled. White's next move pretty much is guaranteed to be getting the White king to safety, castling himself. And Magnus will therefore have a move, maybe even 2 moves, to challenge the White center. And here we go. He gets ready to do so. He first pushes this pawn so that he can next, I think, Robert, your move potentially, push the Black c-pawn and prevent White from stepping forward, gaining even more space. But no, Magnus staying very flexible here. Putting a knight on the rim, it doesn't look like a great square, but later it might hop back towards the center. He's just getting the pieces out. And this is the downside, the double-edged sword of being creative, freestyling in the opening for Wesley. So yes, you've got a healthy position, a playable position, but it's cost you a lot of time. Probably it's going to cost you a lot more time because still so many options on every single move.
And Magnus being non-committal is actually a good approach at this stage because Black can choose which pawn to push, either the c-pawn to challenge the d4 pawn or his d-pawn, go up to d5 to challenge the c4 pawn. He has options here, and knight a6 keeps both of those options alive, as the knight a6 actually helps in the event that you want to play c5 instead of recapturing with the pawn, you recapture with the knight, gaining control of that key e4 square. So White cannot push any more pawns in the center of the board at this stage. Black is ready to do that, so Wesley has to think, which direction is Magnus going to go down? Magnus has not made his intentions clear.
He hasn't, but it has to be around these central breaks that we're talking about. And it might not even be a choice. We might see both these pawns moving forward eventually with maximum tension in the center, visualizing opening ideas with the pawns moving forward, the queen side stepping to e7, the black rooks coming to the center of the board. You get c5, d5 in. And that feels like the ideal opening development that you want with Black. What about the White's pieces? Where do you want to place them in the structure?
And this is the issue. This is why Wesley's burning even more time on the clock right now. He would love to, for example, put his knight on c3. If he gets more time with White, he would love to put his rook across to e1 and throw another pawn into the middle. But the problem in this type of position, as is well known in these types of what we call Queen's Indian structures, where Black fianchettos on the queen side, Black often just plonks a knight onto this e4 square and trades off. Black was slightly cramped due to White having a big pawn center here, so any trade of minor pieces tends to free up Black's position. Of course, this isn't the only approach. Black's knight doesn't have to jump in. Black could go for one of those pawn breaks we mentioned, but this is what forced Wesley to think twice before bringing his knight out. He was scared of a trade of knights opening up this dark squared bishop. So instead, he simply pushes a pawn forward. This is really timid play, really kind of non-committal play by either side. I think they're both waiting for Magnus to kind of strike out in the center, and he does. Now we will see what happens with these central pawns. Likely another one incoming soon.
Even more so than these pawn breaks in the center, I'm looking at the clock. Magnus has built a nearly 4-minute lead on time. And if you're Wesley here, he takes in the center, so a little bit has been clarified. I'm wondering if you're keeping one eye on the clock to make sure that you don't get yourself into too much time trouble. Magnus has not recaptured yet. You think that when someone captures your piece, you just take back. But look at how many pieces he can capture back. He will not be taking back with the queen. That would be a blunder. We typically do not want to lead with the queen when so many pieces are on the board, but he can capture, say, with the pawn. That would be the most normal-looking move, and he does just that. But he was thinking, perhaps I take with the bishop to keep the diagonal open.
Yeah, he takes with the pawn, establishing a long-term presence there. Now, space is pretty much level. The pawn structure slightly imbalanced. White has an extra pawn on the e-file. Black has an extra pawn on the c-file. Black controls the pawn breaks, and it's just about whether Magnus kind of takes a slower maneuvering approach right now, or whether he lashes out and puts another pawn in the center. Black can put a pawn on c5, challenge in the middle, and we'll see maximum tension. It depends on Magnus's mood. He's kind of mixing and matching the plans. This is one you mentioned earlier, Tanya, just bringing the black rooks to the center. It looks very healthy for Magnus Carlsen right now, but still in the balance.
And another plan that comes to play after this trade of pawns in the center is the fight for the e4 square now. Magnus can line up on the e-line, get that rook going, and even jump in with that knight to e4. Meanwhile, Wesley looking for counterplay on the c-line, trying to target that the c7 pawn. I am expecting the c7 pawn eventually to rise up to and once again challenge that d4 center that we've been talking about. But looking at the clock situation, it feels that though Wesley managed to get that one b3 early surprise in, Magnus is the one who's happier with the opening outcome.
Magnus has easy moves to make, but I just want to note that when Black does eventually play c5, it gives White an option to take on c5, either leaving Black with an isolated pawn. So let's just show that, right? You can take on c5, and if Black takes the knight, hopping the knight to the center, you have this isolated queen pawn, and Wesley just won a game from the white side of this type of position against Nodirbek Abdusattorov to eliminate the young Uzbek talent. And if he takes with the pawn on c5, we get what's called hanging pawn structure. And I think this is good for Magnus, considering the clock. But what happens in these hanging pawn structures, it's difficult to move either pawn, because if you push a pawn, you leave a square behind. And let's say you push the c pawn, then White says, give me that d4 square. And I'm ignoring the fact that it's giving away a pawn right now. The main principles of those pawns are very difficult to push because it's such a big decision handing key squares away to your opponent.
Yeah, often there's kind of a really split camp here. Players either love those hanging pawns or they hate them. And I think Magnus, knowing him a bit, he quite likes these hanging pawn structures, but it's a lot of responsibility having these pawns here. They will come under heavy fire in the next few moves, so you need to be ready. And Wesley, again, non-committal with his moves. Rook to e1 looks really, really slow, I've got to admit. Maybe he'll lift the rook up and swing it across to either c2 or d2, but either way, Magnus, he's going for those hanging pawns. He's taking the responsibility on, and he's got extra time on the clock to do so. Looks like Wesley less familiar, less comfortable in these positions than his opponent.
Yes, after that first initial move and surprise, it feels that Wesley's play has been very solid, cagey in this position. But when you don't take the fight to Magnus, Magnus will bring the fight to you. And that's what we're seeing happen in the center right now. He's put the rook on d8, lining up with White's queen, so feels that he's ready with the pieces. The rook from e8 will slide down to c8. I think the big question will come right now for Wesley. Is he going to be the one who takes on c5 with his d4 pawn? Or does he just simply keep the tension on the board as is? Because one thing that Magnus would not like to do here is capture the d4 pawn himself, allowing White's knight to jump to a key d4 square and then be really ideally placed to start targeting the isolated queen's pawn.
If I'm Wesley, I am capturing that pawn on c5, but he's now done under 6 minutes. The time difference is growing between them, but capturing on c5 and then moving that knight on c3 back to e2, take one step backwards just to take two forwards. You're going to leap into the position here because when the knight reroutes to f4, just like in that game against Nodirbek yesterday, you are putting a lot of pressure on the black center. The bishop on b2 is a much happier piece. White's pieces are coordinated quite nicely. So for Wesley, I would be taking that pawn on c5, but I would also be moving more quickly. And he does not take. He instead leaps his knight forward to b5. He's taking advantage of a square that black can't easily kick that knight out of.
Yeah, he's gained a square, Wesley, so this white knight looks pretty strong, but he's also given up this square. It's something you mentioned, you alluded to earlier, Tanya. Black's knight on e4 often is a very strong piece. Anchored by a pawn, nicely supported there. It blocks out this light squared bishop long term, and Magnus instantly seizes this opportunity. Suddenly he's opened his own bishop. With all the four bishops kind of staring off at each other along these diagonals, it's all about whose bishops are better and who holds the key to the center. Suddenly Black's bishop potentially the stronger of the pair here. And queen to e2, evaluation bar slides down slightly. It's all about the clock time, so Magnus has literally double the amount of time. And yes, no obvious moves. Suddenly it's getting a bit sharper, but he's starting to like Black's position.
Move 15, Magnus twice the amount of time on his clock right now, and the one with more control over the center, especially with that last knight jump that we saw. It is undoubtedly pressure Wesley right now. He does make the move queen e2, but not easy to find follow-up plans right now. That queen does defend that bishop in b2, which was pinned just a move ago. You couldn't capture in c5. So perhaps Wesley looking for ways to simplify in the center, and we can expect that pawn takes pawn trade coming up next after queen e2.
And one thing I really like about Wesley's knight jump is he's eyeing that a7 pawn. It looks completely irrelevant, but Black, since the beginning, has wanted to connect the rooks, put them on the d and c files. That rook on a8 is stuck protecting that pawn on a7. So perhaps a clever try from Wesley. I didn't understand it at first, but now that he's protected his bishop on b2, d takes c5 does feel more annoying for Black. That bishop on the dark squares in front of the black king, it's an important defender in the event of a potential attack, whereas that bishop on b2, it's happy to trade off the board here. So I do think that Magnus has a big question in front of him.
And very often when you're playing, and every move doesn't have to be one where you make these big decisions, David, you ask yourself, which pieces can you actually improve? The one piece, as you mentioned, the rook from a8 cannot move because a7 is hanging. But that knight on a6, it's done its job. It managed to get c5 in. Is it time to reroute it, try and find a way closer to the center?
Yeah, there's a few squares for this knight to jump to. If we look at all of the black pieces, as you say, Tanya, when there's no concrete action, when there's no kind of calculation, no attacks, no defense, no threats, why not improve your worst place piece? And Black has two of them, this rook doing nothing. Just to point out Robert's idea here, unfortunately, this pawn would simply fall. You lose a pawn for free. So yeah, it looks like the remaining candidate to be improved is this knight. A few options. You can drop it back, try to trade off for White's knight, but somehow this feels a bit clumsy after a trade. You do get stuck on this open, or what's about to become an open file on the C file, stared down by the white rook. Feels a bit counterintuitive. And the question is, do you go the other way? Do you jump forward with the black knight? The question now persists, what to do with it next? Do you drop back again towards the center? This looks like maybe the most harmonious move to me. And evaluation bar doesn't react. That's very good. Putting pressure on white's center, but it does take a bit of time. And maybe Magnus is just wondering what to do here. For example, if the dark squared bishops disappear, are these pawns strengths? Are they weaknesses? Can Wesley chip away at them? I'm not sure exactly how the game would continue. The queen could give a check, for example. The black king may be forced back, and it looks relatively level to me, but maybe Magnus is looking for something even more ambitious. I think his default setting, though, should be improve a piece, because that would be very logical right now.
When I was growing up, my coach told me that a good way to try to find your next move is ask yourself 3 questions. It's the rule of 3 questions. What's your opponent's threat? If there's a threat immediately, you counter that, you defend against it, you play against it. If there's no threat on the board, ask yourself, what's your opponent's weakness? In this position, there are no big weaknesses right now. The play is still going on. And finally, you ask yourself, what is your worst placed piece? So if none of the 2 apply in the beginning, you go for your worst place, you improve the position. And I think this rule has also been mentioned by Jakob Aagaard, if I'm not wrong.
It's a good checklist to keep in mind because some players think when I can capture, I have to capture. That's not the case here. Capturing on d4, as we've been talking about, that will only help white. Black will be saddled with an isolated pawn. Some trades will happen, and that's good for the side who's playing against the IQP. So knight b4 looks like a very nice move, but perhaps Magnus doesn't like the resulting trades that we saw with a3, kicking that knight back to c6. So for Magnus, who's had a big time advantage, he's using his time wisely, but suddenly it's getting closer on the clock, and that's good news for Wesley So.
Yeah, really long think now, over 4 minutes from Magnus Carlsen. Tanya, earlier you mentioned your move on the board, nice one. You mentioned the pay. Look at the pay differential between first and second.
Whoa.
Ooh,
Whoa.
that was not part of the plan.
Knight a2.
Wow.
That is an intruder.
I've seen Yasser Seirawan games like this where he's talked about funny knight moves, but that knight just trapped itself over here. And in fact, the rook can slide over and the knight cannot escape. The c3 square is covered by both the bishop on b2 and the knight on b5. But what Magnus is doing is saying, go for that knight, I'm going to go for yours in return. And after the move a6, you take on a2, I take on b5. This is looking very interesting, but in a way that white can maybe steal a pawn here, but the queen could get in some trouble. So this is one of these situations where calculation over everything. James Candy, I see you. That's required because bishop a6 at the end of the line, and that white queen is in danger.
Yeah. Is she trapped? That's the big question. If she takes a pawn right now, she gets kicked around, and I think she might be caught. I'm trying to just find the killer blow. She's only got one more safe square. How do you close the net around her? Do you keep chasing her around the board? Is she finally caught in the center?
What recognition from Magnus to see this from a distance. Right? He didn't just stumble into a pawn sacrifice that hopefully works. That's why he was spending all that time here. That queen is trapped, and that's not a usual place for a queen to get trapped right in the center of the board.
And that's not a usual place for the black knight to land on the edge of the board in your opponent territory. Knight to a2, just completely out of the blue. But to play this move, it's one of those do not try this at home moves. If you play this, you need to calculate this line till the very end. And Magnus has gone for the move a6, and Wesley now slows down. If he wasn't to capture that pawn on b5, let's say you take rook takes knight, because there is no other move. You have to capture black's knight. White's knight's got no square to retreat. Black takes it back. If you don't go for this line with queen takes pawn, I'm liking black's pawn structure now. A pawn from the side has moved towards the center of the board. The a file has opened up. This is advantage Magnus.
Big advantage Magnus, especially if he's able to get one more move and push a pawn further down the board, establish a protected pass pawn. But okay, Wesley does find an alternative. He realizes that yes, the black knight is trapped. Yes, the white knight is also trapped, but he can first trade off and make sure that these bishops stare down at each other. Maybe he intends to actually capture this knight with his queen indirectly within the next few moves. This one is really heating up, Robert.
But I have to say, that knight a2 idea is brilliant. Chess.com's game review, it gives brilliant symbols when you make a move that's a sacrifice. It wasn't initially a sacrifice, but the idea is so sublime. It just is such a crazy decision to give away your knight, but to get your opponent's knight in return like this. You could tell it caught Wesley so off guard. So love that decision, knight a2. One of those moves that puzzles everybody, including myself. But then when you see the brilliance revealed, Magnus Carlsen coming up with creative ideas, and now he should take back this knight. He'll take back the pawn on c5 in a couple moves, and I do like his pawn structure here from the black side.
Yeah, maybe he has to be careful here, Magnus